All right, glad to have you back. Now, President Bola Tinubu on Tuesday announced that Nigeria hits its 2025 revenue target in August, driven largely by proceeds from the non-oil sector. According to a statement by the Special Advisor to the President on Information and Strategy, Mr. Biodun Adedipe, President Tinubu disclosed this at the Villa while receiving founding members of the defunct Congress for Progressive Change and the Buhari-led organization. It was led by former Nasarawa State Governor, Mr. Umar Tanko Al-Makura. President Bola Tinubu said the feat underscored the impact of his administration's economic reforms, and he assured Nigerians that his renewed hope agenda remained anchored on infrastructure, renewal, improved health facility, food sovereignty, and security. He disclosed that the federal government would establish agricultural mechanization centers across all regions, boost cultivation, expand harvest, and create jobs. My guest is Chief Consultant, Biodun Adedipe Associates Limited, Dr. Biodun Adedipe. Dr. Adedipe, thank you so much. It's good to have you on the show this afternoon.
Thank you so very much, Tolu. I'm happy to be with you today.
All right, then. I think this is another good one. Economic reforms leading to increased revenue. Government hits revenue targets in August. We've been talking about all of these reforms for months, for years. Now we are getting to this point. I want to get your assessment, understanding of this.
All right. Thank you so very much. Two important things for me here as a Nigerian and also as an analyst, and I'll put it in this context. First is the fact that some 15 years ago, I was one of 23 Nigerians that were appointed to presidential committee to look at a review of federal government expenditure and what we recommend needs to change. In the course of that assignment, myself and another friend of mine who retired then from the Central Bank of Nigeria, Mr. Oleka, were charged with the responsibility of looking at the data in terms of oil revenue, non-oil revenue, the recurrent expenditure and capital expenditure. And we discovered an interesting scenario. And that was the fact that our recurrent expenditure was 150% of our non-oil revenue. And so the committee took a position that if Nigeria is going to get out of the challenge of funding federal government expenditure, we need to work our way to a position where non-oil revenue is exactly equal to recurrent expenditure. So if we're able to do that, it means that oil revenue will be free completely for capital spending and investment. And so we then, as a committee, set a 5-year target for Nigeria, which would have been 10 years ago, now between 2011 and 2015. So for Nigeria to achieve that, of course, nothing happened. So when I look at the figure announced yesterday and observe that for 20.59 trillion naira, when you do a straight line projection of that to the end of the year, we give you about 30.88 trillion naira. Put that against the budget of this year at 57.99 trillion naira, that gives you a space of about 27 trillion, which effectively can be covered by oil and, of course, significantly reduce our budget deficit, as it were, in the plan for the year. So for me, therefore, it is coming to see the reality of what we envisaged for Nigeria 15 years ago becoming so today. That's the first line. Now, the second line is something I've always also envisioned for this nation over many years, that I'm waiting for that day when we do the federal government budget in Nigeria without a reference to how much crude oil we produce and export and what price at which we sell the crude oil. So what this tells me is that we are already in the direction of that, where oil will no longer be the major
All right, then we'll still connect with Dr. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Adedipe. Go ahead. Go ahead. A bit of network challenge there.
Oh, sorry about that. Now, for me, these are two important developments that are defining the way fiscal operations at the federal level in Nigeria are being handled, moving away from dependence on oil revenue, and now also getting to a point where we can become like the Netherlands that had a similar history with Nigeria, where we interrogated this 15 years ago. And we said, how did they get out of it? The way they got out was to grow strongly non-oil revenue and get it to a point where it becomes equal to the current expenditure. So that way, the vagaries of the oil market will no longer be something to worry about. So for me, this is good news for Nigeria, and we need to pursue this particular trajectory. Thank you.
No more borrowing from local banks, also according to Mr. President. And let's look at other sources now of raising revenue, because if we are to raise revenue, we don't borrow. What other options do we have, Dr. Adedipe?
Well, I think one of the things mentioned, which also makes me glad as a Nigerian and analyst, is the fact that there are many moribund assets for the federal government that they will also dispose of. So in which case, why let assets rot and waste where we can extract value from them? Again, this is something some of us have canvassed over the years. So which is very good on the one hand, but I'm also happy about what you just said now, that the government will no longer borrow from the bank, which means it will no longer crowd out private borrowers from the credit market, which is a good development for us as well. Because if government doesn't borrow from that market, it means the market becomes wider and open to private borrowers for private capital formation, which is good for us. And of course, create jobs in the process and then deepen our productivity. Now, that is on one side. Now, equally, if this trajectory continues, and don't forget also, whichever way we look at it, oil still remains important. I will call it the hydrocarbons. So if we now also focus more on what we do in the area of gas, which of course government has also indicated by the executive order signed and other policy, incentives that have been introduced, I see also Nigeria deepening its earnings from gas and not necessarily from crude oil, as it were. So that is on the one side. Then also the massive investment in ICT, especially the digital economy. The government is doing quite a lot in that space, and that can become also a major source of revenue as we proceed, over the years. For me, that's an area to deepen more and then see how we expand our revenue opportunities. Equally, from the data from Central Bank of Nigeria, remittances, the reality is that Nigerians working abroad also make money, and insofar as the environment locally inspires confidence in foreign investors, it will do the same to those Nigerians in the diaspora. And so we may see remittances continue to also expand. And that for me are different, whatever opportunities we have arising from there. Everything comes down to the economic activity driven and then the revenue implications for government from the activities, dropping tax and other levies and charges. So for me, it is about making the economy more productive. The more productive it is, the more revenue we draw for the government.
The federal government will also establish agricultural mechanization centers in all the regions to build capacity, expand cultivation and harvest, and guarantee food sovereignty. That is also something that spikes me in this very important write-up as delivered by Mr. President at that meeting. So how does that also come to you, considering what we used to have before in our agri space? I remember those days of the agricultural, of the central bank intervening into the agricultural space. I think we've gone past that now. The central bank is focused on price stability and all of that. And all of those schemes we used to have, agri-borrower scheme, anchor borrowers and all of that, have been put on the side. So what do you make of this mechanization centers?
Now, for me, it's also a very positive development for Nigeria. And that is on the back of our history of estimated almost 60% post-harvest losses. Yes. Now, we said, how do we address this? Number one is to do mechanized farming. Number two is to do all year-round farming rather than rain-fed farming, which, of course, this government also, I mean, for me, it's a good development. I've started again looking at the river basin authorities, which of course anchor the irrigation systems. Now, if the irrigation systems are well resourced and they begin to work very well, then we can cultivate all year round, all right? But now at a mechanized scale, which means in terms of volume and in terms of, you know, what we might call the variety, we should get to a point where we can address the first key element in food security, and that is availability. Now, if we are able to break the back of availability, then it will key into the second point of affordability. And that is why we deal with food inflation. For me, it's a step in the right direction. But we must also complement that with vibrant irrigation systems and then processing of, you know, farm produce so that it doesn't end at merely the farm gate, but processing and storage that we ensure that the market can be served all through the year. Thereby, we move away from episodic harvest, dampening of prices, and then out of season, prices go up again. So in my view, these are now the complement to what Mr. President has announced. Good step in the right direction.
But now we've touched on inflation. You touched on food inflation. Yeah. We see that after the rebased CPI, we've seen a bit of decline year on year. But I am worried. I think my last check, about 1.99% for that's accumulated inflation figures now. That month-on-month inflation, I'm talking about month-on-month now. We still have that slight increase. Dr. Adedipe, what can we do, one, to address those fundamentals driving this month-on-month increase so that we begin to see the impact of reduction in this, easing on inflation?
Excellent question. Now, one important thing I think we have done is this year we've started measuring core inflation, which now takes us beyond just the headline and food inflation that we are traditionally focused on. Now, core inflation is the root that covers every other item in the economy aside from food and energy. All right? So if we focus on that, it makes us appreciate the fact that it is not only food inflation that's the problem of the economy. That is what it has done. So we are measuring the right things, and that for me is the beginning. When you measure the right things, it gives you also an indication of where attention is needed. So the reason we see, inflation ticking up, especially looking at food inflation, is because all of these plans that the government has made are just coming into implementation and fruition. Just the natural thing. When you plant a seed today, you don't get the harvest the same day. And that is why dealing with inflation, the way I described it earlier, especially food inflation, is a matter of time. You plant today, and then when the harvest comes, is when you get the result. So for me, therefore, it is about dealing with those important plans. And that is what government has done. One, revive the river basin authorities that handles the issue of irrigation and year-round farming. Also, mechanization, expansion of the percentage of arable land that we actually cultivate. And then, of course, processing and storage. Once we can put all of these four together and do them effectively and efficiently, we may now begin to see inflation, track downwards. And that is whether it is food or core inflation, and of course, both of them making up the headline inflation rate. So we may not expect any major dampening inflation rate this year, but with what the government is doing right now and an effective execution of that also at the sub-national level, we mustn't forget that, because analysts often talk about federal. We forget that where the real impact of dealing with inflation can happen is at the sub-national level. If all of these happen, then we may see inflation actually take a nosedive in 2026.
Looks pretty good. But now, stimulating productivity and driving real sector growth is something that I also think, and I think the president is on that on that line, you know, looking at what he's been doing and all. But what more can we do looking at the outlook now? Because we need to start to project 2025 is almost getting to, in a few months, we are getting to the end of 2025. 2026 implementation of the tax law comes on board, and many believe that that's also a pre-election year. So what are those things you think can be done to stimulate productivity and start to, you know, build inclusive growth?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Now, for me, the major issue remaining for us in unleashing productivity will be in manufacturing and, of course, in agro-processing. Now, for us to get very massive traction there, we also need to address the cost of borrowing. And that means going forward into end of 2025 and commencing 2026, the CBN may need to look at its position on the NPR, because the NPR, where it is now, as a signal rate, is driving lending rate at above 30%. Even though CBN data shows about 29.31% thereabout as maximum lending rate as of July this year. But the reality of the market is that lending rate is still above 30%. So if we want to see that come down and unleash productivity in manufacturing and especially in agro-processing, then borrowing costs to investors in those sectors we need to drop. So that is something we need to consider. And of course, the federal government, like Mr. President said, must continue its investment in the infrastructure space. If we continue that, and of course, open areas of opportunities for public-private partnership, then we get an unleashing of productivity at a faster rate that can make the economy grow faster, despite that 2026 will be a pre-election year. That's my view about it.
$1 trillion economy, Dr. Adedipe, before I let you go. And considering what NBS has given us, we are still doing less than $300 billion. Is that not worrisome?
Well, for me, it's not worrisome. You know why? Because each time you talk about a foreign currency, the key issue there is the exchange value of your own currency. These dynamics can change if the Naira appreciates. So the question now is, what will make the Naira appreciate? That means the stability we have achieved now will drive it further by deepening the supply of FX in the market. We are no longer looking at central bank, which has been proven, especially this period between, starting late June up until now, we are seeing the end of summer, all right, when the Naira usually historically lost value. This year, it has not happened. That means there's a hope for Naira to actually appreciate. And appreciating Naira with the drive in non-oil exports, which again is giving us figures we haven't seen in the last 5 years, is a pointer that the exchange value of the Naira on its own can add to that target, that goal of $1 trillion to start with, apart from growing the economy. So two key things there then. We need to grow the economy faster, and that will happen by way of the productivity we discussed, all right? The other side now is the exchange value of the Naira, which means we intensify the incentives for non-oil export, and of course, at the same time, ensure that we deepen our non-oil revenue, that is activities in the non-oil space. Services are still big in our economy. We continue to do things that will make the services sector also remain vibrant. So if all of this happen, we may not hit $1 trillion in my own view, okay? Although 5 years is too long a time where anything can change. Don't forget, the gains of reforms next year will be based on the successful reforms made this year. So if we begin to add the intensified reforms on the back of what we have done, we may actually get the traction and the speed and grow much faster in the latter years, maybe from 27, 28 down to 2030. As we may not hit $1 trillion, but we get something very close to it.
Finally, yes, before I let you go, Doc, the banks are to recapitalize. Insurance companies too are also supposed to recapitalize. And all of these institutions are working in tandem to also achieve this goal. What do you also make of that?
That, of course, we add value.
Okay.
Because the more capital these financial entities have, the more muscle they have, therefore, to support economic activities. So if we look at it in multiplier terms, because what we normally do is take the balance sheet of a bank, look at its equity, and look at the balance sheet footing. The ratio between them shows clearly that the equity is what kicks the business. So if the equity base is bigger, that will kick also bigger business. And so the banks will do more business, not only for them as business entities, but for their customers. So we see a possibility of a massive expansion in the loan books of the banks. And if they're able to create more loans, that means also more economic activities will be created in the process and drive us towards the $1 trillion dollar goal. So there are different opportunities for Nigeria and potentials across different sectors. And I think the government is going in the right direction in terms of the calls it is making. I will put them as the right calls. So if every stakeholder in Nigeria will follow in that direction, pay more attention to opportunities rather than complaining about where there are still challenges, we are likely to find ourselves very close to that $1 trillion goal by year 2030. That is the way I want to put it. Attention and energy more on opportunities and prospects rather than complaining about challenges.
Dr. Biodun Adedipe, I know we can go on and on to the end of this show, but that's our time. I must thank you so very much, as always. Chief Consultant B. Adedipe Associates Limited. Thank you for being on the program. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay.
All right, then.